Hello. In the preceding podcast, I said I would try to explain why it's more difficult to understand a native English speaker than someone who has learnt English as a foreign language. So, first of all, have you ever noticed what's the difference between reach and attain? Soak up and absorb. Give off and emit. Do you swap something with someone else or do you exchange it? And do you try to reach your aim or attain your objective? Very often there are two words which look very different but mean more or less the same thing. These are called doublets. Now, although English is the first language, or at least the official language in all of these countries, and also there's the English which as scientists you have to be able to use, we have to admit that the language began on that little island off the northwest of Europe. So in order to understand why there are two words instead of just one so frequently, we have to look at the history of the language, and that means looking at the history of Britain. Now, like any good history, it begins with the Romans, who in AD 43 invaded the island, and the Emperor Claudius actually brought his elephants in boats with him. Also, I found it amusing that Britain had their own Vercingetorix, and she was a woman called Boudica, who, with her two daughters, almost evicted the Romans, but then was herself defeated. Now, the only problem on the island was from the savage the savage Picts in the north. So the Emperor Hadrian actually built a wall across the island, and that was the northernmost limit of the Roman Empire. So everything would have been fine, but the Romans were having problems back home, and in AD 406 they left the island. And the people living there really would have preferred they stayed because they were being attacked by the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians. Now, the Frisians were important to the development of the language, but everyone's forgotten about them. Even the Jutes no one speaks about, so we'll just call this lot Saxons. Now, the Saxons were a farming community who lived in this sort of village, and they introduced a lot of good farming practices, and the head of the village lived in a house which was just slightly bigger than the rest. So you can see it was quite an egalitarian society. Then came the Vikings. Now, traditionally the Vikings are the big bad warriors who smashed the churches and stole all of the gold, jewels, women. But in fact, they never really took over the whole island, since only this part, the northeast, was really under Danelaw, and the Saxons kept control of the southwest. So, we've had the Romans, the Saxons, and the Vikings. And now who's coming? The Normans. So the only date which every British person knows is 1066, the Battle of Hastings, when William the Conqueror defeated King Harold. If you think about it, you have another name for William the Conqueror. And you can see the battle on the Bayeux Tapestry. The people on the island changed from this Saxon way of life to a feudal system introduced by the Normans. And every village had a manor house with the lord of the manor, the peasants who were working for him, a church, of course, and in fact, even today, you can see the magnificent buildings which the Normans built. The Saxon peasants working in the fields looked after cows, baby cows, calves, sheep, that is to say, ewes and rams, and pigs. However, on the table, the Normans ate beef and veal, mutton and pork. And you can see this difference between the Saxon words and the Norman words has remained absolutely in the language. So when you think Saxon, you think practical, realistic, simple, plain, down to earth. And when you think Norman, you think nobles, upper classes, knowledgeable, and even posh. And we can see the effect in the language, because even now I could mend my car myself. I'd say, come in if someone knocks on the door. I can say, this PowerPoint will not last a long time. It can be wrong. And I can say he looks like his father. But at the same time, if I take my car to the garage, I'll probably have it repaired. You could still hear people who say, enter, when you knock on the door, in Britain at least. And I can say our love will endure. If I say that's incorrect, then I'm bringing into play all of the diplomacy of the Normans. And I can say he resembles his father. Though of course these words like endure and resemble, even though they're perfectly good English words, as French speakers we would be a little afraid of using them. So the practical, down-to-earth Saxons have given birth to the language which I would call informal. The dictionary tells us informal is relaxed and friendly, not following strict rules of how to behave or how to do something. Now this is not to be confused with the French familier, because informal is a cultural way of being for the British, the Americans, the Australians, the Canadians, etc. Now, the formal, something which is formal, that is to say, very correct and suitable for official or important occasions, is not frequently used when native speakers are speaking English. In fact, it's hardly ever used now orally. And if we look at the normal, informal way that, for example, British people speak, I take the British because that's the culture I know, then instead of hearing, good morning, how are you? Someone would probably say, hi, how are you doing? So far, so good. But instead of saying thank you, you'll often hear people say cheers. Or instead of saying goodbye, they can say cheers. So maybe this isn't really a model for international English. Recently, at a byHodder crystallography conference, I filmed the native speakers to see how they were speaking. So while in writing, I could find things like, this is consistent with the absence of a volume anomaly, the same author in the presentation said, and when you look at the volume, in fact you see practically nothing. So you can see the only word which is the same in both expressions is volume. And you can also see that in speaking, people use a lot more words than they ever use in writing. But again, that's another story. So just to sum up, this informal language is chatty and friendly. And the formal register which uses what we call long words, sounds very knowledgeable. So, of course, academic papers are always written in a formal register, whereas an oral presentation, especially, for example, between powder crystallographers, we're all friends together, the native speakers use a very informal register. They use these Saxon words to be plain and simple, and the Saxon words are the ones which are difficult for a French speaker to understand. Then if we take magazines, of course you'd find a mixture of formal and informal language, because the author wants to sound both chatty and friendly while showing that he is knowledgeable. But unfortunately, it's not just magazines, because this mixture of formal and informal language is what we call English. So, thank you for listening, and I would just like to make one last little point. When I was looking for a map of the Franks, the only one I could find was this. I discovered that the Plantagenets reigned from the Arctic to the Pyrenees. Now, the Plantagenets, can we really say British, or do we say French? Britain and France have a really long shared past, and that again is another story.